Hello everyone and welcome back to my little corner of the internet. My name is Evian and she's done! Can you tell that I'm excited? Because I really am. Today we're gonna work on all these small details that bring the cosplay together and we're gonna make her broom! If you're new here, hello, welcome! This is part number 5 of a video series I have of making a cosplay of Marisa from Toho. And if you want to follow along from the very beginning, I have all the other episodes linked down below in the description, along with a few different resources I use for this project. And with all of that out of the way, I have nothing left to say, so let's just get started! So let's just pick it up where we left off. Because even if I finished Marisa's apron in the last video, there is one vital part that is still missing, and that is her giant bow. My main concern was how to make the bow sturdy enough to hold its shape. My solution for this was to make a core for the bow, much in the same way I did for the bow on the hat, but instead of using foam this time, I used some thick felt since I knew I would be sewing through it. I always try to waste as little material as possible, but since the felt I used are only sold in 40 by 40 cm squares, I unfortunately had to cut into 2 of them to get the 2 halves I needed. I sewed the 2 halves together at one side and moved on to prepare the casing for the bow. The casing was just a large rectangle of white cotton fabric that I ironed some interfacing on to give the fabric some body. The next step was to pull the casing on the felt, and then I played around with draping the fabric until it looked sort of scrunched up and bow-like. I carefully sewed the draping in place to not break any needles. The next step was to fold the back of the bow in and sew it in place. It was way too thick for the sewing machine now, so I had to do this by hand. And now, with a decent looking bow at hand, it was now time to make the tails for it. This was one long piece of fabric that tapered in towards the middle, and as with everything else on this cosplay, this was also interfaced, though with a heavier interfacing to make sure the tails would keep their shape. I folded it right sides together lengthwise, sewed along the edges, clipped the corners to reduce bulk and turned it right sides out. After a thorough press, I just hand sewed it to the back of the bow. And now it was time to think about the attachment. Remember the piece of Velcro I sewed to the apron in the last video? This is where that comes into play. Though the Velcro alone isn't enough to keep it in place. To make it more secure, I took some inspiration from pre-tied obi belts. I made a weird little structure out of wire and covered it in bias tape for comfort. I sewed a simple rectangle to make up the knot of the bow and sewed the Velcro piece to it. The piece itself was attached to the back side of the bow before I sewed the wire on. I made sure to sew it on in a way so that the wire would have a lot of flexibility. To finish the bow, the rectangle was folded around the center and through the wire and stitched in place. And this is how the attachment works. Ended up a bit crooked there. That's better. But you get the idea. This method turned out to work very well, and the bow stayed in place even after 10+ hours at a convention. I mentioned when I was making the skirt that I added straps and clasps to hold potion bottles and pouches, because I mean, what is a witch without her potion bottles? But since this is Marisa, I needed some stars for decoration, so that's where I began. I sculpted a star out of polymer clay. This took way longer and was a lot more annoying than I thought it would be, but it turned out alright. It was also thoroughly amusing to put this one tiny star in the oven to bake, all alone. As I did with Marisa's button, I sanded the little star as smooth as I could before I made a mold out of silicone putty. Then began the process of casting a bunch of these. For painting, I also follow the same process as the buttons. First I sprayed them with primer, followed by a couple of coats of red spray paint before they were painted with acrylic paints. They were finished off with a nice coating of glossy varnish. From here, I could move on to the potion bottles. I was lucky to find some perfect looking bottles at the local trinket store. I measured the circumference before I started the task of making leather straps. These were made out of the same faux leather fabric I used for the straps of the skirt. They were glued, folded, and pressed. I also made sure to only keep one layer where they were going to attach to something else to reduce bulk. All the straps also got a decorative stitch with a thick denim thread. From here it was all just a matter of gluing, measuring, gluing some more, do some reinforcing stitches, and more measuring and gluing. It was basically just a lot of experimenting to see what would work. To hide the raw seam on the front of the bottles, I cut out a circle of leather, painted the back and weathered the front, added a decorative stitch and the resin star. This really finished off the bottles nicely, and despite my doubts through the process of making these, I am very happy with the results. The next step was the pouch. I used the same leather fabric as before, found some blue fabric in my stash to use as a lining, and the same denim thread I used for the leather straps earlier. For this I drafted my own pattern. It's a basic pouch that I made sure would be able to hold my phone and wallet. I drew out my pattern on the fabric. The back and flap of the pouch was one piece, the front was one piece, and I also made a piece for the inside of the flap that would both be decorative and hide the raw edges of the lining fabric. I made a side piece that wrapped around the entire pouch that I fastened my D-rings to. I also added a magnetic closure, which I have been very happy with in previous cosplays, and the insides were covered with the lining fabric before I started gluing all the pieces together. I really wanted the look of a real leather pouch for this, which is why I attached all the pieces with the raw edge on the outside. The edges were also sewn together for more stability. Quite honestly though, my sewing machine isn't exactly made for sewing through these thicknesses of heavy fabrics, but I made it work by going slow and very steady. To further make the illusion of a leather pouch, I put wood glue on all the raw edges to simulate how the edge of real leather projects have a smooth finish. This was then painted with dark brown paint. I used acrylic paint to weather the pouch before I finished the whole thing off with another one of those star patches to hide the closure. And ta-da! Another thing done. Here's the gloves. Okay, story time. The gloves were really fighting me the entire way of making them. So making the pattern went pretty smoothly. AK Viri released their pattern on basic cosplay gloves directly in my time of need. And after the first mock-up, all I needed to do was to widen the pattern a bit and start on the real thing. But by now, at this point, I had entered crunch mode. My first convention in 2 years was sneaking up on me fast, which meant that this was the worst time possible for something to go wrong. Long story short, it took me 4 attempts to make these gloves, and by the 3rd attempt I had ran out of the original fabric I was going to make them out of. So I had to use the same fabric I used for the skirt and vest for the final pair, and these were hand sewn on the train to the convention. And I didn't film any of it. But I finished them! Now, if I didn't feel the con crunch enough while making the gloves, I definitely felt it while making the broom. This was something I couldn't finish on the train or in the hotel room before the convention, so this was absolutely first priority. I had originally planned on making a lantern to hang from the broom handle as well, but because of the crunch and because the broom would be more accurate without it anyway, I decided to drop it, and it helped a lot on my mental health on the last weeks before the convention. As with everything else, I started with a pattern. I wasn't too sure how I wanted to make the bristle when I started out with this, so I left it pretty basic in the pattern just to have a size reference. One thing I was sure of, however, was that I wanted the broom to split into several parts. So I measured the PVC pipe I used as a base and cut it into 3 parts. I decided to use the bamboo look for Marisa's broom, and this turned out to be a smart move since I could split the broom in the grooves of the handle. To prepare the pipes for glue, I sanded the entire surface of each piece with a rough sandpaper. I also smoothed out the rough sawed edges. We're not exactly blessed with a large selection of pipe sizes where I live, so I had to improvise a bit. To make the attachment for the pieces, I wrapped a smaller pipe in some 2mm self-adhesive foam, and this was enough to make them fit perfectly into the larger pipe. Like this, I glued 1/2 in place. And just a little pro tip here: use gloves that aren't 2 sizes too small. I drilled holes for magnets in the other half of the smaller pipe to make sure the pieces could just snap in place when I put them together. The next step was to mark out where all the bamboo grooves would be on the handle. To make these raised, I used foam clay, let it set, and then sanded it all into shape. Afterwards, I covered it all in 2mm foam. This left the handle smooth, and I'm rather proud of how it all camouflaged the joints. Though because of some miscalculation, I was left with some very visible seams where the foam didn't quite reach around the pipe. To remedy this, I filled all the gaps with some lightweight filler. It was all sanded flush once it was dry. Now it was time to tackle the bristle. Once again, A MARISA Cosplay came to the rescue with their basic shapes pack. This turned out to be super useful for me as the bristle was mostly made out of cones and spheres. I carefully built the shapes by making paper patterns first, transferring it to foam, gluing it all together, and sanding it into shape. I used the wood burning tool to make deep textures in the foam. For the largest part of the bristle, I had now decided that I wanted a bit of a bell shape to it. I also wanted there to be some illusion of motion to it, so I experimented my way into a bell pattern that kind of swooshed out on the side. This pattern was cut out of foam, and all pieces were glued together with contact cement. I realized pretty fast that this first try was way too large though, so I cut the entire thing apart, narrowed the pieces down considerably by cutting them, and glued them back together again. To give the bristle some depth and dimension, I cut additional long diamond shapes out of foam that I glued into triangles and glued onto the base. This didn't feel quite organic enough yet, so I added even more small pieces to make it more broomy. The only thing left to do of the main build now was to close the bottom. I did this by making another large cone shape, glued it in, and glued on additional foam pieces to make it all more 3D. After it was all glued in place, I took my rotary tool and sanded it all as smooth and flush to the base as I could. Another pro tip for you all: do the sanding before you glue the pieces to the shapes. I was in a rush with this one, and I wanted it to come together as fast as absolutely possible, but it would probably have been a lot cleaner and a more pristine build if I had just sanded the pieces before I started gluing them on. It's also always practical to have a friend or partner who can help you get rid of the abundance of foam dust that is generated from sanding props. To finish up the texture of the broom, I once again used my wood burning tool to create deep grooves. I also used this to make some texture around the grooves on the handle. I used some foam strips that I beveled into shape as the ties on the broom, and then I assembled everything with contact glue. With this, the main build was done and I was getting really excited of where the entire thing was going. The next step was to prepare it for paint, and I simply did this by priming the entire thing with wood glue. Wood glue is a bit prone to cracking, but the broom isn't supposed to be flexible anyway, so I was okay with using this method for this particular project. And now it was finally time for my favorite part of prop making, the paint. You should have seen my face when I got the first layers of paint onto this thing. It was like everything suddenly fell into place. I used acrylic paint for the entire thing, where I started with a base coat before adding details, shading and texture with watered down paints and darker shades. Despite the crunch and late evenings, I had a lot of fun painting this prop and I am very happy with how it all turned out. And with the broom done, that means that everything is done. She's done! Marisa was originally going to be this quick, easy project to get me properly back into cosplaying again, but she turned out to become so much more. And at several points throughout the creation process of her, I seriously thought she would not get done and that I would give up. But here she is, and truth be told, I am so happy with how she turned out. For those of you who have watched this series from the very beginning, might remember that my original plan was to compete with Marisa at a particular convention, but that convention was cancelled, so I decided to just do it as a fun project for myself and change up the design a bit and not care so much about accuracy. I wasn't going to compete with her anyway, so the accuracy didn't really matter, right? Well, that was a lie. I had worked so hard on her and I really wanted to get into the cosplay contest scene, so despite the inaccuracies in her design, I decided to bring her to a first-time convention called MAGICON that was held in February of this year, and I also signed up for the cosplay contest with her. And I had so much fun! Despite MAGICON being a first-time convention, the people that was running it are very experienced in the cosplay and competition scene, and they did such a good job organizing everything. There was such a good tone between everyone that was backstage, and it was so much fun to perform my first solo performance in cosplay. I mean, thank you so much, Mia, for helping me with voice acting and the script edits. Thank you. And I was super proud to leave the con having won second place! But another thing I really need to mention about all of this is that thanks to the con crunch and thanks to all the stress I had before the convention, I was feeling less than good. Luckily, it was only a one-day convention, but through the entire thing I was tired, burned out. I was in physical pain. And even though I had really fun at the contest, I had no energy left over to actually enjoy the convention, and I did not feel like I could be myself at all. So let this be a PSA and a reminder to myself in the future: do not con crunch! It's not good for you! Although this time it was kind of worth it. But with that said, thank you all so much for joining me on this little journey. I know my uploads have been few and far between, and I cannot promise that this will get any better in the future. However, I do have plans and a lot of footage for more projects and videos in the future, so I hope you'll stick around and I'll see you next time. Bye!